Before you decide who someone is, you usually notice what they are wearing, often without realizing how quickly the mind begins to build a story from color alone, attaching meaning, intention, and emotion to something that has not yet spoken. Some people feel most like themselves in dark clothing, not occasionally, but consistently, choosing black, deep tones and muted shades even when brighter options are available. And this choice is often misunderstood as mood, attitude, or withdrawal. But what if it has less to do with hiding and more to do with regulation, control, and internal clarity? What if darkness, for some minds, is not a signal to the world, but a way of reducing it? In this video, we explore the psychology behind people who prefer dark clothing, not as a trend or an aesthetic, but as a reflection of how certain minds experience stimulation, emotion, and identity. If this kind of quiet psychological reflection resonates with you, consider staying with the channel and subscribing. And let me know in the comments what dark clothing has meant in your own life. When someone walks into a room wearing dark clothes, something subtle happens in the minds of others almost immediately, often before a single word is spoken, before posture or tone has time to register, and before any real interaction begins to form, because the human brain is constantly searching for shortcuts, small visual signals it can use to build a story quickly, even if that story is incomplete, distorted, or quietly unfair. Dark clothing tends to trigger assumptions that feel instinctive rather than chosen. Assumptions about mood, personality, intention, or emotional state, as if black, charcoal, deep navy, or muted tones are somehow speaking on behalf of the person wearing them, suggesting seriousness, sadness, distance, arrogance, mystery, or even threat, depending on the observer's own experiences and emotional history. What is rarely acknowledged is how little these interpretations have to do with the individual standing there, and how much they reveal about the observer instead, because color perception is deeply tied to memory, culture, and personal association, not objective truth, and the mind often reacts to what darkness symbolizes internally, rather than what it actually represents in practice. In many cultures, dark clothing has been linked to formality, authority, grief, restraint, or professionalism. And over time, these associations harden into expectations, so that seeing someone dressed in darker tones activates an emotional response long before conscious thought has a chance to intervene, creating a quiet narrative that feels real simply because it is familiar. This is why people who prefer dark clothing are often described in broad, imprecise terms, labeled as introverted, closed off, intense, or emotionally heavy, even when their actual behavior contradicts those descriptions entirely, because the visual cue has already framed the interaction, shaping perception before reality can catch up. There is a psychological comfort in these assumptions, both for the observer and for society at large, because they simplify complexity, allowing people to feel as though they understand someone quickly, without the discomfort of sitting with uncertainty or withholding judgment. Even though this quick understanding is usually an illusion, for the person wearing dark clothes, this process often happens invisibly, sensed rather than articulated, noticed in subtle shifts of behavior, in the way conversations start cautiously, in the way people hold a bit more distance, or sometimes project expectations that feel strangely misaligned with who they actually are. Over time, this repeated experience can create a quiet awareness, a recognition that clothing has become a filter through which others approach them, not necessarily by choice, but by pattern, and that awareness itself can deepen the divide between appearance and inner reality. What makes this dynamic particularly interesting is that many people who prefer dark clothing are not attempting to send any message at all, at least not consciously, because their choice is often rooted in comfort, familiarity, or internal coherence rather than performance, yet they are still assigned meanings they never intended to communicate. The mind of the observer fills in the gaps, projecting motives, emotions, and personality traits onto the surface, as if darkness is an invitation to imagine depth, seriousness, or emotional weight, when in truth it may simply reflect a preference for simplicity, consistency, or visual calm. This is where the first misunderstanding begins, because dark clothing is often interpreted as expressive, as though it is meant to be read, when, for many people, it functions in the opposite way, reducing expression rather than amplifying it, lowering the volume of the external signal so the internal world can remain uninterrupted. Psychologically, humans are drawn to color as a source of stimulation, novelty, and information, and when color is minimized, the absence itself becomes noticeable, creating a vacuum that the mind feels compelled to fill with meaning, often assuming intention where there is none. This tendency says less about dark clothing and more about discomfort with ambiguity, because when something does not immediately explain itself, the mind rushes to explanation, even if that explanation is built on assumption rather than evidence. For people who wear dark clothes regularly, this can lead to an odd duality, where they are both overlooked and overinterpreted at the same time, fading into the background in some contexts while being scrutinized in others, as though darkness simultaneously hides and highlights them, depending on who is looking. This contradiction is rarely acknowledged openly, but it shapes social interaction in quiet ways, influencing how people approach, trust, or distance themselves, and reinforcing the idea that appearance carries emotional information, even when that information is unreliable. Over time, this dynamic can make those who prefer dark clothing more aware of the gap between how they are perceived and how they experience themselves internally, a gap that does not necessarily cause resentment, but often leads to reflection, observation, and a subtle detachment from surface-level judgments. Rather than reacting defensively, many learn to let these assumptions pass through without resistance, understanding that first impressions are rarely about truth, and more often about pattern recognition, cultural conditioning, and emotional projection. This acceptance does not mean agreement, but rather a quiet acknowledgement of how perception works, and how easily the mind reaches for symbols instead of substance, especially in a world that values speed over depth. Dark clothing, in this sense, becomes less about identity and more about the environment it creates around the individual, an environment where others may hesitate, project, or misread, revealing more about themselves in the process than about the person they are observing. The irony is that the very thing people assume is expressive is often chosen precisely because it feels neutral, grounding, and unobtrusive to the person wearing it, allowing them to move through the world without constantly adjusting, explaining, or presenting themselves for interpretation. This first layer of misunderstanding sets the foundation for everything that follows, because once a person is framed through assumption, subsequent interactions are filtered through that frame, reinforcing beliefs that were never examined in the first place. And so, Before any deeper psychological meaning is even considered, it becomes clear that the preference for dark clothing exists within a social context, shaped by perception, projection, and the human need to make sense of others quickly, even when that sense is built on very little. The story begins not with the person wearing dark clothes, but with the mind observing them, already busy constructing a narrative, long before the person themselves has had a chance to speak. There is a common belief that people who choose dark clothing are withdrawing from the world, as if the absence of color signals avoidance, pessimism, or a quiet refusal to participate. Yet this interpretation misunderstands the direction of the movement entirely, because for many, the choice is not about stepping away from life, but about narrowing it into something more manageable, more focused, and less intrusive. Modern life is visually loud in ways most people no longer consciously register, saturated with color, motion, contrast, branding, and constant signals competing for attention, so much so that the nervous system rarely receives a moment of rest, even when the body appears still, and for minds that are already sensitive, reflective, or internally active, this excess can feel overwhelming rather than stimulating. Dark clothing functions, for these individuals, as a quiet form of reduction, not a dramatic statement, but a way of lowering the volume of the external world, simplifying the visual field so that fewer decisions need to be made, fewer reactions triggered, and fewer energies spent managing unnecessary input. Psychologically, the brain is always processing color, even when we are not aware of it, linking hues to emotion, memory, and expectation, which means that bright or varied clothing does not simply decorate the body, but continuously interacts with perception, both internally and socially, creating subtle demands that some people would rather not carry. Choosing dark clothing removes many of these demands at once, creating a consistent, predictable surface that does not shift with mood, trend, or environment, allowing the person to conserve mental energy for things that feel more meaningful, more complex, or more inward. This is not a rejection of beauty or expression, as it is often framed, but a preference for a different kind of order, one that values coherence over variety, depth over stimulation, and continuity over novelty, especially in individuals who already experience life with intensity beneath the surface. For these people, color can feel like noise rather than enrichment, not because it lacks value, but because their internal world already provides more than enough stimulation, and adding excess on the outside only fragments their attention further. Dark clothing, then, becomes a way of controlling the environment without controlling others, shaping personal space through visual simplicity rather than boundaries or confrontation. A silent adjustment that requires no explanation and draws little conscious notice, even as it changes the experience of moving through the world. This reduction has a calming effect on the nervous system, particularly for those who are introspective, analytical, or emotionally perceptive, because fewer external signals mean fewer interruptions to internal processing, allowing thoughts to unfold without constant redirection. It is important to understand that this does not mean these individuals lack creativity or emotional range, but rather that they prefer to locate those qualities inwardly rather than wearing them outwardly, trusting their internal landscape more than external decoration to hold complexity. In this sense, dark clothing acts almost like a background color, steady and unobtrusive, against which inner thoughts, emotions and perceptions can move freely without competing for space. Much like silence allows certain kinds of music to exist more fully. There's also a sense of control embedded in this choice, though not the kind that seeks dominance or visibility, but a quieter form of agency, where the individual decides how much of the world they allow in, and how much of themselves they give out, without needing to negotiate that balance constantly. For people who experience the world deeply, small inputs can have large effects, and reducing visual complexity becomes a practical form of self-regulation, not avoidance, but maintenance, ensuring that internal resources are not depleted by unnecessary stimulation. This is why many people who wear dark clothing describe it as comfortable, even when the fabric itself is no different, because the comfort is psychological rather than physical, rooted in familiarity, predictability, and the relief of not being visually pulled in multiple directions. Over time, this preference often becomes habitual, not because the person is attached to darkness as an idea, but because the reduced sensory load becomes associated with clarity, steadiness, and a sense of being properly oriented within oneself. From the outside, this can be misread as monotony or lack of interest in change, but internally, it often supports flexibility rather than limiting it, because when fewer resources are spent managing appearance, more energy remains available for thought, observation, and emotional awareness. Dark clothing does not remove the individual from the world, but filters it, allowing them to engage selectively rather than indiscriminately, which is particularly important in environments that demand constant social performance and visual responsiveness. This filtering effect also extends to social interaction, because a simpler visual presentation tends to reduce unsolicited attention, comments, or assumptions, creating a social field that feels less demanding and more controllable. In this quieter field, conversations often begin more slowly, interactions feel less performative, and the individual has more space to observe before engaging, which suits personalities that value depth over immediacy and reflection over reaction. What appears, then, as withdrawal is often a form of refinement, a deliberate narrowing that makes room for focus, meaning, and internal continuity, rather than an attempt to disappear or disengage. Dark clothing becomes a tool, not a shield, helping the person move through a crowded, overstimulating world with a sense of steadiness that might otherwise be difficult to maintain, especially when internal sensitivity is already high. This chapter does not suggest that darkness is inherently calming or superior, but rather that for certain psychological types, it aligns more closely with how their minds function, offering relief where others might seek stimulation. The reduction of the external world allows the internal one to remain intact, unfragmented and responsive, not because the individual fears intensity, but because they experience it already, quietly and continuously. And so, what looks like an escape from color is often an attempt to stay present, grounded, and mentally coherent in a world that rarely pauses long enough to consider how much it asks of the mind simply to be seen. Emotional distance is often misunderstood as indifference, coldness, or lack of care, especially in a culture that tends to equate openness with authenticity and visibility with emotional health. Yet for many people who prefer dark clothing, distance is not a rejection of connection, but a way of regulating it, ensuring that emotional exchange remains sustainable rather than overwhelming. Every social interaction carries an emotional cost, however small, because attention, responsiveness, and empathy require energy. And for individuals who are perceptive, inwardly attentive, or emotionally porous, that cost accumulates quickly, often without immediate awareness, until fatigue, irritation, or withdrawal appears. Dark clothing can support a subtle form of emotional moderation, creating a visual signal that discourages excess engagement without explicitly asking for it, allowing the individual to remain present without being constantly drawn into the emotional currents of others. This is not a conscious strategy in most cases, but an intuitive adjustment learned through experience, where the person notices that certain presentations invite more projection, expectation, or emotional demand, and others allow for quieter, more balanced interaction. In this way, dark clothing becomes part of an unspoken boundary system, not rigid or defensive, but flexible and responsive, helping the individual regulate how much emotional input they receive and how much output they are expected to provide. People who are emotionally sensitive often absorb more than they realize, picking up on tone shifts, micro-expressions, and unspoken tensions, and without adequate boundaries, this sensitivity can become exhausting, leading to a need for recovery that others may misinterpret as aloofness or detachment. By minimizing visual expressiveness, dark clothing reduces the number of emotional cues others feel invited to respond to, simplifying interaction and lowering the intensity of social exchange without eliminating it entirely. This reduction allows emotional presence to remain intentional rather than reactive, giving the individual more control over when and how they engage, rather than being pulled into emotional labor by default. There is a quiet intelligence in this form of self-regulation, because it acknowledges emotional capacity as finite, something that must be managed rather than endlessly given, especially in environments that reward constant availability and responsiveness. From the outside, this controlled distance can appear as mystery or reserve, but internally, it often feels like balance, a state where emotions are neither suppressed nor spilling outward uncontrollably, but held in a way that preserves clarity and steadiness. Dark clothing supports this holding, not by hiding emotion, but by reducing the pressure to display it, allowing feelings to exist without being immediately interpreted, evaluated, or reacted to by others. For many, this creates a sense of safety, not because they fear emotion, but because they respect its depth and understand the consequences of exposing it without discernment. This is especially true for individuals who have learned through past experience that openness can attract misunderstanding, over-involvement, or emotional intrusion, leading them to seek forms of expression that protect rather than advertise their inner world. In such cases, emotional distance is not avoidance, but wisdom, a recognition that not every interaction requires full access to one's internal state, and that selective openness can preserve emotional health over time. Dark clothing quietly supports this selectivity, providing a consistent external tone that does not fluctuate with mood, allowing the individual to choose when to be emotionally available, rather than having availability assumed. This choice becomes particularly important in social environments that reward performative emotion, where visibility is often mistaken for honesty and restraint is misread as absence. By maintaining a steady, neutral appearance, individuals who prefer dark clothing can move through these spaces without being pressured to match emotional intensity or reveal more than feels appropriate. Over time, this approach can deepen self-trust as the individual learns to honor their own emotional rhythms rather than adapting constantly to external expectation. This does not mean they are emotionally closed, but rather that they value depth over immediacy and prefer connection that develops slowly through consistency and presence rather than through rapid emotional exchange. The distance created by dark clothing, then, is not empty space, but breathing room, allowing emotions to settle, clarify, and be shared deliberately rather than impulsively. It also encourages others to approach more thoughtfully, often leading to interactions that are quieter, more focused, and less performative, where conversation replaces display and listening takes precedence over expression. In this way, what appears as emotional reserve can actually support deeper connection because it filters out interactions driven by surface cues, leaving space for those built on genuine curiosity and mutual respect. Dark clothing becomes part of a larger pattern of emotional self-care, helping the individual remain open without becoming overexposed, engaged without becoming depleted, and present without losing themselves in the emotional demands of others. This balance is rarely visible at first glance, which is why emotional distance is so often misinterpreted. But for those who live within it, it is not a wall, but a quiet structure that allows emotional life to continue without collapse. There is a form of control that seeks visibility, recognition, and affirmation, and there is another form that operates quietly, without drawing attention to itself, shaping experience from the inside rather than attempting to influence perception from the outside. And people who gravitate toward dark clothing often align with the second kind without ever naming it as such. In a world that rewards display, confidence is frequently confused with loudness, and authority is often mistaken for visibility. Yet psychological stability does not require either, because true control is less about how one is seen and more about how one experiences themselves while moving through uncertain environments. Dark clothing supports this internal control by reducing variability, creating a consistent external frame that does not fluctuate with mood, trend, or social context, allowing the individual to remain anchored while circumstances change around them. This consistency is not rigid, but stabilizing, especially for people who think deeply, feel strongly, or notice more than they express, because it prevents external appearance from becoming another variable that demands constant adjustment. When clothing becomes predictable, the mind is freed from a subtle but persistent task, that of managing impression, allowing attention to shift inward toward decision-making, observation, and emotional regulation. This is why many people who wear dark clothing describe a sense of steadiness or composure when dressed this way, even in situations that might otherwise provoke self-consciousness or uncertainty, because the external signal remains neutral, reliable, and unintrusive. Control, in this context, does not mean dominance over others, but coherence within oneself, the ability to remain internally aligned regardless of external pressure or expectation. Dark clothing quietly supports this alignment by removing the need to negotiate appearance as a form of social currency, reducing the temptation to adjust, impress, or perform in response to shifting social cues. For individuals who value autonomy, this matters deeply, because every adjustment made for the sake of appearance carries a psychological cost, a small compromise that accumulates over time, often without conscious awareness. By choosing dark clothing, the individual limits these compromises, creating a personal environment where fewer decisions are outsourced to external approval, and more are guided by internal preference. This form of control is often mistaken for seriousness or severity, because it lacks the visible markers of ease or playfulness that brighter colors are culturally associated with. Yet internally, it often produces the opposite effect, a sense of calm that comes from not being pulled in multiple directions at once. The absence of visual fluctuation allows the individual to remain emotionally centered, responding to situations with deliberation rather than reaction, which can be particularly valuable in moments of stress, conflict, or social complexity. Others may perceive this composure as confidence, mystery, or even detachment, but what they are sensing is often internal regulation rather than emotional distance, a steadiness that does not need to announce itself to be real. Dark clothing also reduces the likelihood of being visually categorized into transient roles, such as trendy, playful, youthful, or performative, allowing the individual to occupy a more stable identity that feels less vulnerable to external interpretation. This stability can feel empowering, especially for those who have experienced the discomfort of being misread or overinterpreted based on appearance, because it provides a consistent baseline from which interaction can unfold. There is also an element of containment in this form of control, a sense that one's internal life is not constantly leaking outward, available for consumption or judgment, but held with care and intention. This containment does not suppress expression, but delays it, ensuring that when emotion, thought, or creativity is shared, it is done consciously rather than impulsively, preserving depth and authenticity. Dark clothing becomes part of this containment, acting as a visual boundary that supports internal discipline without requiring explanation or justification. Over time, this way of moving through the world can cultivate resilience, because the individual learns to rely less on external validation and more on internal coherence, trusting their own sense of balance rather than chasing affirmation. The control here is subtle but durable, built not on power displays or attention, but on consistency, self-knowledge, and the ability to remain internally organized under pressure. This is why people who prefer dark clothing often appear composed even in unfamiliar or challenging environments, because their sense of control does not depend on external harmony, but on internal alignment. What looks understated from the outside can feel deeply grounding on the inside, creating a quiet authority that does not seek to influence others, yet naturally shapes how interactions unfold. Darkness, in this sense, does not diminish presence, but refines it, allowing control to exist without announcement, influence without performance, and stability without spectacle. There's a subtle connection between the colors people choose and the kinds of thoughts they are accustomed to carrying, not because clothing creates depth, but because it often aligns with it, settling naturally around inner landscapes that are already dense, reflective, or emotionally layered. People who feel comfortable in dark clothing are often familiar with heavier thoughts, not in a dramatic or depressive sense, but in the way someone becomes familiar with weight through carrying it for a long time, learning how to balance it, how to move without strain, and how to let it exist without constantly needing to explain or resolve it. Heavier thoughts do not always announce themselves as sadness or seriousness, and they are not necessarily negative, but they tend to involve complexity, contradiction, and long attention spans, the kind of thinking that does not rush toward conclusions or easy optimism. For individuals who think this way, brightness and visual excess can feel discordant, not because they reject lightness, but because their inner tempo is slower, deeper, and less compatible with surfaces that demand immediate response or emotional clarity. Dark clothing mirrors this internal rhythm, offering a visual stillness that does not compete with thought, allowing contemplation to unfold without interruption, and giving space for ambiguity to exist without pressure. This familiarity with weight often develops early, shaped by introspection, responsibility, sensitivity, or exposure to emotional complexity at a young age, leading the individual to grow inwardly before they are ready, carrying questions that do not resolve quickly, and learning to sit with uncertainty rather than escape it. As a result, external simplicity becomes appealing, not as a rejection of richness, but as a counterbalance, a way to prevent the outside world from adding unnecessary layers to an already full internal experience. Dark clothing supports this balance by remaining visually quiet, allowing heavier thoughts to move freely without being pulled outward or turned into spectacle, preserving their depth rather than flattening them into expression. There is also a certain honesty in this alignment, because dark clothing does not attempt to lighten the internal weight or disguise it as something else, but coexists with it calmly, without exaggeration or denial. This does not mean the individual is somber or joyless, but that their joy often has a quieter texture, rooted in understanding rather than excitement, in meaning rather than stimulation. For people comfortable with heavier thoughts, seriousness is not a burden, but a state of attentiveness, a way of engaging with life that values substance over speed and depth over immediacy. Dark clothing reflects this attentiveness, signaling not despair, but presence, a readiness to engage with complexity without needing to simplify it for comfort. From the outside, this presence can feel intense or distant because it does not rely on visible cues to reassure others, yet internally it is often accompanied by steadiness, acceptance, and emotional literacy. Those who live with heavier thoughts tend to be less threatened by silence, pauses, or unresolved questions, and dark clothing naturally fits within this tolerance because it does not insist on explanation or decoration. There is also a protective quality here, not against emotion itself, but against trivialization, because reducing visual brightness helps guard inner depth from being misread as moodiness or dramatized as darkness. In this way, dark clothing becomes a companion to thought, moving alongside the individual without interfering, supporting contemplation rather than interrupting it. Over time, this alignment strengthens, as the person notices that their internal state feels more coherent when the external environment is visually restrained, creating a sense of harmony between what is seen and what is felt. This harmony is quiet, often unnoticed by others, but deeply felt by the individual, reinforcing the preference not through ideology, but through lived experience. Darkness, here, is not an aesthetic choice alone, but a psychological resonance, a shared tone between inner and outer worlds that allows heavier thoughts to exist without friction. When the external world does not constantly demand brightness, the internal one is free to move at its own pace, carrying weight without strain, depth without defense, and seriousness without apology. There comes a point for many people when clothing stops feeling like a way to express who they are and starts functioning as a way to stay aligned with who they already know themselves to be. And for those who prefer dark clothing, this shift often happens quietly, without announcement, as a natural response to self-understanding rather than a stylistic decision. Expression is outward-facing by nature, shaped by how it will be perceived, interpreted, and received, while identity is inward-facing, concerned less with reaction and more with coherence, and dark clothing often supports the second more than the first. For individuals who have spent time observing themselves, questioning their motives, and refining their inner landscape, the urge to constantly communicate personality through appearance tends to fade, replaced by a desire for stability, continuity, and psychological comfort. Dark clothing offers this continuity by remaining consistent across contexts, moods, and social settings, allowing the individual to feel like the same person regardless of where they are or who they are with, rather than adapting their external presentation to fit each environment. This consistency reduces internal friction because it removes the need to perform subtle identity shifts throughout the day, preserving energy and emotional integrity. Rather than asking, "What do I want to show today?" the question becomes, "What allows me to remain myself?" And for many, the answer lies in simplicity, restraint, and visual neutrality. Dark clothing does not announce personality traits or emotional states, which can feel limiting to those who rely on expression for connection. But for others, this restraint feels freeing because it removes the pressure to be legible at all times. Identity, when it is internalized, does not require constant confirmation, and dark clothing supports this internalization by allowing the self to exist without continuous external reinforcement. This is especially meaningful for individuals who value privacy, not as secrecy, but as preservation, a way of keeping the inner world intact without needing to defend or justify it. By minimizing expressive cues, dark clothing shifts attention away from surface-level interpretation and toward substance, allowing interactions to unfold based on presence, language, and behavior, rather than visual suggestion. Over time, this shift can deepen self-trust, as the individual becomes less dependent on appearance for orientation, relying instead on internal values, boundaries, and emotional awareness. This does not mean they lack style or intention, but that their intention is directed inward, toward alignment rather than display. Dark clothing becomes a form of grounding, a familiar frame that supports internal stability in a world that often demands constant reinvention and visibility. There is also an element of maturity in this preference, as the need to be seen gradually gives way to the need to feel coherent, and external expression becomes secondary to internal consistency. For some, this shift follows periods of exploration, experimentation, or even overexpression, after which restraint begins to feel like relief rather than limitation. Dark clothing, in this sense, marks not withdrawal, but arrival, a settling into oneself that no longer requires explanation or performance. Identity over expression does not mean the absence of creativity, but a relocation of it, from surface display to inner construction, where ideas, values, and meaning take precedence over appearance. This relocation can make the individual appear reserved or unreadable, but internally it often brings clarity, because the self is no longer fragmented across multiple external versions. Dark clothing supports this wholeness by providing a stable outer layer that does not compete with or contradict the inner one. In a culture that often equates visibility with authenticity, choosing restraint can feel countercultural. Yet psychologically, it can be deeply affirming, reinforcing the sense that one does not need to be constantly interpreted to exist fully. This chapter is not about rejecting expression, but about recognizing when expression has served its purpose and when alignment becomes more important. Darkness, here, is not about hiding, but about staying anchored, allowing identity to be lived rather than displayed. There is a final misunderstanding that often surrounds people who prefer dark clothing, perhaps the most persistent one. The belief that darkness is chosen in order to hide, to disappear, or to withdraw from being seen, when in reality, for many, it represents the opposite, a state of comfort with being present without being exposed. Hiding implies fear, avoidance, or shame, a desire to shrink away from attention because it feels unsafe or undeserved. Yet the psychology behind dark clothing rarely aligns with this motive, because those who feel most at home in darkness are often not running from visibility, but redefining it on their own terms. To be seen does not always mean to be understood, and for people who have learned this distinction early, visibility can feel hollow when it is built on surface cues rather than genuine recognition, leading them to seek forms of presence that do not depend on constant visual affirmation. Dark clothing allows this kind of presence, one that is steady rather than performative, grounded rather than reactive, offering a way to exist fully in a space without inviting interpretation at every moment. This is especially important for individuals whose inner lives are rich, complex, or carefully protected, because constant visibility can fragment that inner continuity, pulling attention outward and forcing premature translation of thoughts and emotions that are not yet ready to be shared. Darkness supports containment, not concealment, allowing the individual to hold their inner state intact while remaining outwardly available, a balance that many find difficult to achieve through brighter or more expressive presentation. There is also a form of confidence embedded in this choice, though it is not the loud confidence often celebrated socially, but a quieter certainty, the confidence of someone who does not need immediate feedback to confirm their existence or worth. This confidence does not seek to dominate attention, but neither does it avoid it, instead allowing attention to come naturally through interaction, substance, and presence, rather than through visual demand. Dark clothing supports this by neutralizing the external signal, removing the urgency to be noticed, and replacing it with patience, an openness to being discovered slowly rather than declared immediately. For many, this slow visibility feels more honest because it aligns with how trust, understanding, and connection actually develop, not in flashes, but through consistency over time. Darkness also offers a kind of emotional privacy that does not rely on isolation, because one can be surrounded by others, fully participating, while still maintaining an inner boundary that preserves depth and autonomy. This boundary is not rigid, but responsive, allowing closeness when it feels appropriate and distance when it is needed, without requiring verbal explanation or visible defense. In this way, dark clothing becomes part of an internal agreement, a signal to oneself rather than to others, reinforcing the right to move at one's own pace, to reveal selectively and to remain whole, regardless of external expectation. People who live this way often develop a strong sense of internal orientation because they are not constantly adjusting themselves in response to how they are seen, but checking inward to ensure alignment between thought, feeling, and action. This inward orientation does not remove them from the world, but stabilizes their position within it, allowing engagement that is deliberate rather than reactive. From the outside, this steadiness can be mistaken for withdrawal, because it lacks the visible markers of enthusiasm or expressiveness that are often used to gauge engagement. Yet internally, it often reflects a deeper level of participation. Darkness, in this sense, becomes a neutral ground, a place where the self can rest without being interpreted as a role, a mood, or a message. It allows the individual to exist without explanation, to occupy space without justifying it, and to be present without constantly narrating their internal state through appearance. There is also an element of self-respect in this choice, because it honors the idea that not everything valuable needs to be displayed, and that some aspects of the self gain meaning through preservation rather than exposure. For people who have experienced being misunderstood, overanalyzed, or reduced to appearances, dark clothing can feel like relief, a way to step out of the cycle of projection without stepping away from connection. This relief is subtle, but cumulative, building over time into a sense of ease, where being oneself no longer requires constant negotiation with external perception. Darkness does not erase individuality, but refines it, stripping away excess until what remains feels essential, coherent, and internally grounded. In this refined space, the individual can engage more authentically, because they are not managing layers of external signal, but responding from a place of internal clarity. The absence of brightness creates room for nuance, for quiet humor, for thoughtful presence, and for emotional depth that does not announce itself, but can be felt by those who pay attention. This is why people who prefer dark clothing often form fewer but deeper connections, not because they are selective by design, but because their mode of presence naturally filters interaction toward substance rather than surface. Darkness does not repel connection, but invites a different kind, one that unfolds slowly, without spectacle, grounded in consistency rather than impression. At this point, it becomes clear that dark clothing is not a strategy for hiding, but a way of remaining intact, allowing the individual to exist in the world without being fragmented by constant interpretation. It supports a form of psychological sovereignty, where the self is not handed over to public reading at every moment, but held with care and intention. This sovereignty does not isolate, but stabilizes, creating a quiet center from which interaction, creativity, and thought can emerge naturally. Darkness here is not absence, but space. A space where the self does not need to be louder to be real, brighter to be worthy, or more visible to be present. It is simply a place where being is enough, and where the individual can move through life without needing to constantly explain who they are through what they wear. And in that space, darkness is no longer something to be interpreted, judged, or explained, but something that feels, at last, like home.